لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Goal of Sufism is the divine, meaning not to become God, astaghfirullah, but to realize the ever-present nature of Allah's presence in our life, that to realize His oneness in the center of our being, to realize Tawheed existentially. In other words, the very fact that that is considered by many of the knowers of Sufism as the goal of Sufism is, and there's no other sacred science that actually has this goal, makes Sufism the very heart of Islam, the very essence of Islam, and also makes it the very crown of the achievement of the possibility of Islam. Right? So therefore it has a very special place when we look at it like this. So you can say that the purpose of Sufism is to realize the divine unity, the reality of the divine unity existentially, or experientially. So to realize, in other words, Sufism can be said to be this process of realizing, or a movement from conceptual theological tawheed to spiritual and experiential tawheed, or existential tawheed. Right? This is really what we're trying to do in Sufism. So with that said, as you all know, this would entail something quite profound that's immediate in our understanding, that if we're speaking of Tawheed, or the divine unity, then, and we understand even theologically that that shirk is to associate with God and His unity in worship, right? To associate others with Allah, as the ma'bud, as the one who is worshipped, is shirk, or is association. If this is the case theologically, then existentially or epistemologically and existentially in one's awakened heart, to realize Tawheed there means that you cannot be present because you would be an other. Meaning your conscious awareness of yourself cannot be really present if you have realized, or if you are realizing Tawheed in your heart. Right? It's not just an object of perception. It encompasses the object and the subject as pure realization. This is what the divine unity is. So from this angle, this is precisely where the doctrines or the teachings of Fana and Baqa come into play. That if you understand what I've just said, then its natural consequence is a recognition of what is termed Fana and Baqa, because the starting point of the human soul is separation from its a divine source, distance from the source, a sense of a self-centered consciousness that is the human soul, that is seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is seeking spiritually to travel to the divine from within their heart. Right? This is really what Sufism is about. Right? And so this is probably a good way to frame this a discussion. So in this process, there is a process of of refinement of the self, of this kind of self that is self-centered, that is impulsive and selfish, that purely identifies with its own body and its mind, and the desires that it has for itself, and what it wants in the world for itself. From that level of human consciousness, of the egoic identification with our impulses and the desires and what we want, there's what is called saluk, or a process of spiritual transformation of this consciousness, or the center of consciousness, this kind of selfish consciousness, to something that becomes selfless, realizing at the center and the essence of the self, the divine presence, the unfolding of which, the awakening of which is this process of Fana and Baqa. Right? So this is really what's happening, or what is intended to actually happen in Islamic spirituality, in the process of the Dhikr Allah and everything that we can talk about. There's others in this context who then may emphasize or say that that one of the purposes of Sufism is simply the remembrance of God, and that is accurate. All of these are not wrong, but we're specifying what the subtle or the true goal is, right? Because in other words, when we look at this carefully, a definition like that, Sufism is to establish the remembrance of God, to make the remembrance of God a more permanent awareness in you. Then something else that is at the center of your being and your consciousness has to be displaced, at least a bit, if not entirely, or it has to become, in other words, transparent to this work of practicing presence, practicing the presence of God's presence, which is the dhikrullah, the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that should not be lost sight of, that in order to have a permanent presence with God in your heart, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your heart, then not only must one become transparent by refining the self that wishes continuously to take that center seat always, which pulls us back into our conditioning and our impulses and all of these things that identify ourselves with our ego self. In this process of the refinement, to realize transparency is to realize the illusion of this kind of separate self, the Nafs, and its usurping of the center of your being and your knowing, right? Which of course is a natural unfolding. It happens at some point. We are more fully identified in our human development with our nafsani consciousness. And then for all of us, it takes a particular role. And for most of us, when it becomes a healthy ego, a healthy self, right? If I'm going to use these terms, at some point, really from the Islamic spirituality trajectory, at some point, the human soul has to realize that it is really incomplete without an awareness of Allah and to conform to Allah's will, to God's will. And this becomes its work in order to really find itself and what it is. And it can only find itself in God, in Allah's presence. And so this is really that process. So in this trajectory of you could even bring here the hierarchy of needs and these sort of things because they're interesting, but it's not the whole story, but they're interesting supports for this. But this trajectory of what the human soul is, it must eventually come back to its realization in the divine from which it originally came from. And that is its return to the spirit, to the inner realm of spirit, which belongs to God, to the divine presence, who has permitted the borrowing of this spirit or a part of it, or however it is, to be embodied very uniquely in your soul, experienced as your soul. So that spark of the divine presence and consciousness that is contained at the center of your being as spirit is what animates what you are, what your possibility is in Allah's consciousness of you. If this makes any sense at this point. And then you are, as an archetype in Allah's omniscience, you are rendered existent by virtue of the spirit that then embodies your individuality, to your essence, to your archetype, into this being. And then we lose awareness of our source. And then all of life is about first developing as a separate self or as a nafs that feels isolated from others, distant and different from others, but is on a journey to find its home, as many of the Sufis call it, a journey to find its home, its original home. And so this is the process. in this, then, it's very important to understand that there will be levels or degrees or modes of self-knowing that will occur in the context of the practice of spiritual purification, the remembrance of God, the refinement of the Nafs, the actualization of the intellect, the awakening of the spiritual heart, the unveiling of the secret, the innermost secret with Allah. All of this is, I didn't mention spirit here because all of this is spiritual, right? It is the spirit that has allowed your awakening to consciousness in this realm and to identify with the body that you have received from God and the mind that you have received from God and its effects as your soul and your nafs, etc. All of this is spiritual. So in reality, everything that you're doing is a spiritual experience. Actually, it's not just or only, or it's not just, or it's not a physical experience even in haqiqah. You're not really having a physical experience. I'm not really having a physical experience when I'm touching this keyboard or I'm moving my fingers on this, although it appears and I'm experiencing it perhaps as a physical sensation. The sensation is arising in my awareness, and I know the experience in and as my awareness, actually. In reality, although its modality and its perception is that my hand, that I have a physical hand by my visual input that is touching this, and the proof is the physical sensation that arises as I touch this and as I move it, even with the physical sensations of moving, right? Yet when I go to the experience, all that I know of the experience is the knowing of it, or all that I am of the experience is the awareness of it. My point in demonstrating by this exercise is that your awareness of that experience, is rooted in awareness. Your awareness, your presence of awareness is nothing other than your spirit in Islamic teachings. Yes.
Sort of this physical car engagement, this physical reality, it's like the smoke that comes from the fire, but it's just like the evidence of this actual existence, which is the flame.
Yes. So that's one analogy that can be used and is used by many individuals, many of the Sufis, also many of the philosophers, in terms of the effects. So what we see in this realm is the effects of spirit, very much like the smoke is an effect, is a secondary cause, the primary cause being that of the fire, right? And so that's a perfect analogy for something like this, rather than keeping it on the conceptual level of this, because it's a valid analogy, which points to that anything occurring here is kind of secondary. I'm bringing it to not just an objective concept, but actually a subjective reality in how I framed it. But it's the same. But it's pointing to the same reality that that at the end of all of this is a spiritual experience. But it's interesting that what we do and what naturally happens is we identify ourselves with the smoke and the movements of the smoke, as if that's what we are, right? We identify ourselves with how I'm feeling right now. If I'm angry, I'm angry. I identify myself as angry. If I've had these accomplishments and I have this image of myself as an accomplished person, I will identify myself as an accomplished person. If I have strong feelings, again and again, of being a worthless person or just feeling a lot of suffering, then I'll be a suffering person, right? But that I that is doing all those things or is identifying like that is prior to any of those experiences. That I is causeless from this angle and is not affected, entirely unaffected by how you feel. Actually, when you look carefully, very much analogous to the fire being actually unaffected by the smoke. So the smoke philosophically is an accident to the substance that is the fire, if we want to use that conceptual terminology, right? Accidents and substance. This is what experientially it means. So in reality, the accident cannot affect the substance, yet it does for our human state. We identify with the accidents. We become the accidents, right? Now, accident here is being used in a neutral way. I don't mean it's a negative kind of limitation. Philosophically speaking, it's a neutral conception, right? It's a neutral terminology. But the point here is that when I feel a lot of anger, I become angry, right? If I'm angry, and I'm really angry, my face may flush. I may have like the dilation physiologically. I'm explaining to anybody, right? Or I might turn into the Incredible Hulk. But that's my point. Like the internal state of the emotion may manifest physiologically on me. Yet my point is that the I that I really am is in reality unaffected by um, the anger, which is now affecting my face and all these things, meaning that in that moment, and probably for a long time, I've identified with whatever has caused me to be angry. And I've identified with the anger such that I become an angry temperamental person, right? So these are secondary attributes or accidents that we have become, right? This is the nafsani consciousness, right? But coming back, and I'll get back to the nafsani consciousness, or I'll get right into it. But my point in the demonstration is even of the very simple touching this table that you cannot see because I'm too near the camera. But if you imagine that I was touching this brown table here, for those who can't see online, you can touch yourself, your hands even. When you do this, although you're doing this, if you try to verify by your direct experience and try to shut your eyes, you will notice that the only thing real here is your perception of it. Okay, when you open your eyes, okay, oh, I have these two hands, they're moving, and I'm feeling something. I'm also feeling movement, etc. When you shut your eyes, you have just a sensation and also perception of movement, but sensations, which may suggest movement, which the suggestion and the conclusion is a perception of movement, right? So if you boil this down, it's a sensation. The perception turns into a sensation. If you boil the sensation down, it's a knowing in your awareness that you're having this. And like, in other words, if we were to go into meditation, it would be an arising of an experience in your field of awareness. You can take anything and do this. You can take your own hand and move it around your fingers. You can take the sensing of your breath. All of this is actually arising in your awareness, no matter how real it is, right? What you really know of it is the sensation, and ultimately behind that, what you really know of that is that it's arising in an awareness. What you really know of that is the knowing as such, is the awareness as such. My point in that demonstration, which you can verify by your direct experience, is that Islam calls that the ruh. Existentially, when you return to that is you having a ruhani experience. So even just a mundane thing is a spiritual experience. This was my point. Anything that you do, picking this up, being present, having the realization of Fana and Baqa, going to the bathroom, feeling upset, all of these are spiritual experiences because they're perceptions. Because they're arisings in the field of spirit, of the ruh. That's a mystery of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we somehow participate in. So the goal is to live your life recognizing permanently that you are always the spirit having spiritual experiences, right? If that would be your actual way to live, and that is something that you verified and that is now has become obvious for you, in contemporary terminology, you are an enlightened one or an enlightened person. Notwithstanding, can a person be enlightened? I'm not going to go there, right? So all of these things are a spiritual experience, but the point is we are highly identified with our impulses, our feelings, our sense of self-image, and all of these are effects or the accidents that we were talking about as the nafsani consciousness. This is not what we are actually, but yet we have to become this so much that it is our now what we believe to be our essential nature. Yet it is not our nature, in reality, as we've just kind of demonstrated. Right? So it's important to understand this, so the spiritual work then is to come back to a place of self-knowing that at each stage, if we call it a stage of returning to what we are, is a self-remembering, a self-knowing, a mode of self-knowing. So Islamic spirituality speaks of this in multiple levels, of this process of, purification, of a refinement, right, of all these things, um, as an awakening to a particular latifa. If we're speaking of self-knowledge, right? We may, as we were first saying, we may have been identified with. So when I'm angry and that dominates my consciousness, I am an impulsive self at that point. I'm a nafs. And even the nafs in Islamic spirituality has categories, right? The impulsive nafs, nafs, then nafs al-amara, right? For example. But putting those categories to the side, you are identifying what's more central to you and your belief unconsciously and consciously of yourself at that moment is the egoic consciousness, the self-centered consciousness, right? Of the lower self or of the outer self. We can call it the outer self. We want to use that term. So the purpose of Islamic spirituality is to bring us back and refine ourselves by the process of remembering what we are. In other words, by the process of the remembrance of God, of the Dhikr Allah, back to our essence in its divine origin. This is what we're doing. Right? This is what the Dhikr Allah is. This is what Plato speaks of when he speaks of anamnesis, which is one meaning ultimately of the essence of what the Dhikr is. It is to remember what you are in God's presence, what you always have been and still are in the divine proximity, your immutable essence. But I don't want to now get into concepts that take you out there, but actually to bring you back in here in your direct experience, what you are as presence, as spirit. So you're a spirit having spiritual experiences that are being embodied at every moment in this realm, right? And to the extent that that defines what you are and you identify with all of that, and it begins to shape your essence, what you are, this is what you become. So the process of the Dhikr Allah is a returning, actually, to what we are. It's a returning. It's a returning, which really means a letting go of things. It's not really an accomplishment. It's a returning to what you already were, but you forgot. So therefore, you have to do dhikr and remember. They forgot God, so Allah made them forget themselves. Right? This is the verse. Right? So there's a connection between forgetting yourself and forgetting God. So therefore, by the same logic, the Quranic logic, if we were to inverse that, inversely speaking, the more you remember God, the more you remember yourself, your real self, in God. Right? This is the purpose of that kind of logic, that you were made to know God in the essence of your being, not just out there, right, or something like that. You were made to know Allah directly, which ultimately means that you were made to be as if a mirror or a medium in the essence of your being, or in the substance of your being, the root of your being, and the essence of your knowing, that you're made to be a medium for God to recognize himself in you, through you. This is an important point. And this comes back to this topic of what we're speaking of, that this is the realization of the divine unity in the center of your being, in the essence of your knowing. That you are made for Allah to bear witness to himself in an apparent other that exists as you. So this is really what Fana and Baqa, are about in Sufism. This is what it's about. And so if we were to say that the purpose of Sufism or Islamic spirituality is God, this is exactly what it means. Like the goal is this. There's no other sacred science in Islam that has this as its goal. The goal is God. That shows the sublime nature of this science and this art. right? What does that mean? We just explained it in the last half hour, kind of what that means, right? In the context of Fana and Baqa. So when we speak of having a permanent awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that can only ultimately mean that you have consciously become absent from that, that permanence of awareness of Allah's presence. And that what abides is the reality of that presence that now is beginning to embody itself in your life, right? Unfold itself, embody itself. So what I've just said in the last minute, right, that sentence or two, part of that sentence is fana. The other part of that sentence is baqa. Very important to understand this, that that fana is, and some would say that fana is the goal of Sufism, and that's a beautiful, laudable, and very noble definition. I've read this in some places where the highest achievement, and it's a profound statement, that the highest achievement in Sufism or of the soul of the Sadiq is to realize fana. And the purpose of saying this is twofold. One is because you cannot attain God, but you can vanish, you can disappear, you can dissolve into the divine presence, very much like the identity of the drop of water that believed it was a separate, autonomous, different drop of water returns to the ocean and loses its limitations, which formed it as an separative identity as the drop. This is fana. This is a beautiful goal, but it's not the only goal, right? It's a profound goal. But the point is that, yes, the goal or the highest achievement of the drop is to lose itself in its origin, in the source, as ocean. So the farthest it can go, meaning the limitation, the accident of the drop, is the ocean, but when it turns into nothing, right? Kind of sounds scary at the same time, kind of. If you really go in, it's like, does that mean I'm no longer there? Poof, I'm done. Right? That's a good question that I hope you all actually have asked yourself, because it may come up like, where do I go? Wow, is that it? Well, subhanAllah. So I end. Well, and if you don't ask that here and now in spirituality, you may ask that there and then, that okay, if Allah is forever, eternal, beginninglessness and endlessness, then, and only Allah has this attribute or this definition, then, and heaven is somehow eternal, but not like Allah. It has a beginning. It's not beginninglessness, but it's kind of like perpetually endless. But only Allah is endless, al-awwal, al-akhir. Then does heaven end? And if it does, then what happens to me? Right. So if you don't ask that now spiritually, you will ask that. You should be asking that if you're a person of faith, if you have insight into these matters. Like some people don't even go there. They're like, I just want to go to heaven, bro. They're like, stop talking like this. Right. And I respect that. Right. That's fine. Right. But I'm sure each and every one of you, to some extent, have asked this. Maybe then dismissed it because the consequences or the potential consequences is very scary. Yes. Yes. Right. So that's where even the more wild ones in spirituality come in. It's like, I'm not even real to begin with. Right. But that is so. This is all interesting. What we believed we were or are is an illusion. In reality, the drop of water does not have a separative existence. It may appear so, and it may temporarily so. Therefore, it does not have. It is contingent, right? Upon the ocean or upon the water to be what it has kind of formed into. It will eventually evaporate or return, right, to its source. So, therefore, by virtue of this logic or this understanding, it's illusory, actually. It does not have the existence it believes it does, but yet it knows it exists. It doesn't realize it's always existed as water or as the ocean, but in the modality of a drop. It identified with the modality and made it its home. Right. So when we look at it like this is what has Fana. Right? In Sufism, by the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by a combination of grace and recognition and a whole lot of other factors, ultimately just being the divine will, which is independent of all of these things, even independent of your practice, and even independent of where you are inside of Islam, outside of Islam, how old you are, how young you are, male, female, anything. This recognition or spiritual experience, if we want to call it this, and a spiritual knowing of Fana, or because it's kind of paradoxical, how can you know if you're like an illusion, right? Is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a grace of Allah. And when you pass away like this in Fana, you can say that then what is really you and always has been you, the inmost or the reality of Allah's presence, recognizes itself as itself. IT capital SEL, ELF, itself. Right? It recognizes itself as itself, becomes kind of self-aware. It's a center of self-awareness. We call this in Sufism, in some schools, the sir, the innermost secret, that now has awakened to itself. So what does it awaken to itself? Right? When you wake up, what are you waking up to physically? When you wake up in the morning, to yourself. Right? You were dreaming this whole time. Wow, and you woke up. Okay, oh wow. Right, so I'm not about to die. Right, or whatever it is. Oh, I had these huge mansions. I don't have them anymore. I'm back in this place. Oh my God. Right. You wake up. Right? You wake up to what you actually are. Right. So your life that you lived was a dream. It was an illusion, but it was real. On this level, just like the dream. Right. People are asleep, and when they die, they awaken. According to a hadith or a saying of Sayyidina Ali, die before you die, meaning wake up before you are woken up by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the whole purpose of the path is this. So when we die, before we die, that is fana, right? So that we wake up before we are woken up, that waking up to what we are and what we've always been is baqa. So when this occurs, when this happens by the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the Sufi method, in the Sufi path, in Suluk itself, and may it occur for all of us, Ameen. In this lifetime, Ameen. In the here and now, Ameen. And if not then at least at the moment of death, where you align your dying before you die with the moment of dying. Ameen. And so when this happens, when fana occurs, then what's really left, when it actually occurs, what's really left is for that which always has been to naturally unfold in you and abide in you. Right? This is baqa, it's process. So these two things are processes. They're not just static things, right? This is a misconception that many people get into is fana station, is baqa station, and all of this. The very subtle of the Sufis would say at best, the experience of fana is a state. It can't be a station because it's a recognition of an illusion. That's not a station. Whoever you thought you were is not what you are. So the recognition is just a snapping out. Right? It's a state. Right? But the real trick question is, who did it occur to? So these are really the real kind of Sufi Zen koans. Who has fana? Right? Who has fana? If everything I've just said is accurate, who is actually having the Fana, the experience. If you're not real in the way that you believe yourself to be, and then you're annihilated, then who's actually having that experience? So Fana is like the beginning of awakening to what you are, because it's a falling away, it's a shedding away of what you were, what you never were. But it is an experience, it's a paradox. It's a kind of profound experience, right? And for some of the Sufis, it's an experience, there's an experiential sense of this, but it's ultimately rooted, especially in Sufism and in other spiritualities, it's rooted in a profound kind of knowing. It's rooted in a existential knowing, not just an experience. It's a conviction. It's a knowing of conviction by certitude, by yaqeen, and this is a Quranic term actually, connected closely with death. Actually in the Quran itself, that you pray until you have certainty. This is a verse. You can try to quote me on that if you know the Arabic. Right? So what does that mean? That's an interesting verse, right? Pray until you die, until you have yaqeen, meaning of that which you're praying to. At your death, you have certainty of what was unseen is now seen. SubhanAllah. So the purpose of the spiritual path is to die before you die, is to have yaqeen of your unseen nature, the essence of it, of what you really are. That has always been unseen in you. It's always been the unseen seer. You are the unseen seer of all the things that you see. You've always been this, actually, but you got lost in yourself. You got lost in your thoughts, in your feelings, in what happened to you 50 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 2 days ago. You got lost in that. You got lost in a very important life experience. I don't mean to downplay any life experience. I'm not trying to do that. Speaking, very mystically here. No offense if I'm offending you. You got lost in an experience because you were always the unseen seer, seeing that, witnessing that experience. But you weren't that experience, actually. But the experience happened to the one who was seeing it, who's unseen. If you go back to that one, right, then you realize that enlightenment or fana does not happen to the one who believes they were enlightened or had fana. So what falls away, what is annihilated, is the illusion of what you believed you were. This is not conceptual, right? So I'm not talking about a knowing up here. I'm talking about a knowing here, where the binary of knowing and being, or the duality of this, is transcended by an integrated oneness of this realization, where your knowing is your being is your knowing. That's what I'm talking about. That's the recognition I'm talking about, when you know finally what you are, right? In the language of the Sufis, um, the Sufis say that only God can know God in you. Right? So you cannot know God, or you cannot see God. God sees God. God is the seeing. God is the unseen seer. So if you have come back to your own self and verified that you are the unseen seer, and you've always been this from the moment that you were born, and all the experiences that you had as a baby until now, right, that you're this unseen seer, then understand that Allah is the unseen seeing behind that even. Kullu man alayha fan. All things in your life, all things in existence will perish, are perishing, are having fana. Kullu man alayha fan. All the things are coming and they're going, they're perishing. your identities, your phases of your life, all this are perishing. They're coming and going. What your body was at the age of 4 is not what it is now. It's coming and going. What you were thinking about then is not what you're thinking about now. Your maturity now is not what it was then, and it certainly won't be like 5 years later. Coming and going. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. Right? Right? And what abides in all of this perishing is the presence of your Lord. SubhanAllah. Full of majesty, nobility. Right? Yes, Muslim. Yes, yes. So not knowing is knowing. He said it even more simple, like in a more simple way, like not knowing is knowing, right? Right. Kind of this matter. So real knowing is an unknowing. You can say, if we were to use, Buddhist wisdom here, right? To translate the meaning of this profound statement, like not knowing is knowing, right? Unlearning is real, like learning, or unknowing is real knowing, right? It's a beautiful cone, if we want to use this language, right? So not knowing here is knowing here. Not knowing is knowing, right? So we can stay up here and say not knowing because you've hit a wall, like that's knowing because you hit a wall. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu. You've hit a wall. You know yourself, and by that you know your Lord. He goes beyond that, right? Right. But this is all up here, and it's beautiful. Like that's enlightened mind. Not knowing is knowing here. Conceptually, we can understand that, and there is still a distance or separation, right, between the unknowable and what we can know, right? It is resolved here, where subject and object meet, right? God can't be, or reality can't be known as an object. This is why we hit a wall. Cannot be known as an object of our perception, right? This is why Allah says every object of your perception is coming and going. It's in Fan, it's being annihilated, it's in Fana. But the knowing subject ever abides, right? This is what the Hindus call Atma, knowing subject, pure witness, the divine witness, the divine within. Only Allah can know Allah in you. Right? Is the door shut? I don't know. Okay. No, it's okay. I just wanted I'm hearing kind of a family member, and there's a family member upstairs who has a loud voice. It's an African and a Punjabi thing. I don't know. This is so I have like sometimes I'm like loud voices speak from their chest, mashallah. Uh, the it's actually a cousin of mine. He sounds like he's yelling at someone. He's just speaking. Right? So some people just have that and self-awareness. But anyways, um, but this is an important matter, right? So not knowing is a form of knowing, but also not knowing when you give up this kind of knowing because you see its illusion, that it can't know beyond that limit. It awakens you to another kind of knowing, right? Right? This is the knowing of the heart, of the awakened heart. This is what ma'rifah is, right? This is when you recognize the real in and as yourself, capital S. This is ma'rifah. This is recognition, right? And this is one of the meanings of wujud in Arabic. So wujud means finding. So does which then, but actually one of the meanings of wujud is to be found, is finding. So when you find yourself, or when you find God, you are found by God. You have, in other words, you've returned to wujud, to being. So wujud actually technically means being. So when you return to your own being, when you find your being, you are found by God's being. Not knowing and returning is knowing. Right? This is Fana, with a view to now trying to live a life of Baqa. Right? So this is why, I would say that in reality, Fana is not the highest accomplishment. You can say it is. Yes, when we speak of highest accomplishment or the most profound accomplishment, yes, right? It's to give up the search out there. This is what's happening. That is the most profound accomplishment that you can make, actually, spiritually speaking. So that does end that, right? The end of seeking Allah as if you see him out there is to realize that he sees you and through you, as you, as your innermost essence, as your secret, right? This is the real meaning of that hadith, like the most ultimate meaning, right? To worship Allah is ihsan. So the starting point of ihsan is to worship God as if you see him, but if you do not see him, the Prophet ﷺ was obviously smiling at that point. And if you do not see him, because it may be obvious intellectually, conceptually, that you can't see Allah. Verily, he sees you. And depending on where you put the stop on this interestingly grammatical statement of the hadith, right? You can, as Ibn Arabi very masterfully does, is he puts a stop, on this, right? In certain places where then it changes its meaning or like the wording, which opens up to a deep meaning, a deeper meaning of the same hadith. That and if you do not see him turns into and when you are not, right? And when you are not, you see or he sees you, right? Isn't that amazing? So when you are not, when you have realized pana, when you are not, you recognize that the seeing was always the seeing of your unseeing seeing, that was you, was always Allah. He sees you. Somehow by mystery, by the mystery of the mystery or the inmost mystery of the secret, somehow, mysteriously, you participate in that seeing. You participate in that. You bear witness to the divine witness at this point. This is Baqa. This is then Baqa. And you, once this is established in you as an existential recognition in your practice, in your contemplations, in your life, in your practices, all the things that you do, it will naturally begin coming out. It will naturally begin unfolding. You'll naturally begin relating from this realization, from this. I mean, when we say realization, we don't mean like an accomplishment, right? We just mean like the recognition of what has always been the case, actually. So it's not special like that. It's actually an unknowing, an unlearning, a returning to what was, right? This is what it is. And it's from here that the unfolding, the alignment with the tawfiq of Allah, the ni'mah of Allah, begins occurring naturally. There's no more major efforting to be aligned with the divine presence because you can't shake it anymore, right? We're really good at shaking it off, right? By our forgetfulness, right? This is the process of purification leading up to Fana. You got Fana and then you even lost that. Come back down a little bit, right? We're playing snakes and ladders here. If you ever played that game, right? That's a good one, right? That's a good one, right? Right? Oh, look at that ladder. You just went down, buddy. You went down like 10 rungs. You're at the beginning again, or you're halfway, right? Right? Snakes and ladders, which, by the way, some say is a Sufi game. Is this, it's kind of interesting. So it has like a spiritual, mystic origin, actually, snakes and ladders. So it's interesting that came up, but that's really, it's a profound way to understand it. Like, I got it, I lost it, oops, right? Very slippery, very subtle. Oh man, I was there. I felt it in the Muraqaba for just a few seconds. I was there, gone, right? I got it, I lost it, right? Until you really found it, right? Until you really found it. I remember it was in in medical school, I was rotating, and so I was warming up the car, and I was going to get late, as I always do, right? But got up very early. It's like these surgery rotations, you had to be there early, so I got up early. The Hajj time was something like that. Then I had to go. I was unable to find the keys, and I was like, "What is going on? I can't find the keys." I looked everywhere, every possibility, went into the room, kind of all of that everywhere, and then the thought arose, no, you should look under the dresser underneath it. I was like, then my mind said, there's no possible way that this key got all the way down under the, this is impossible. I don't even put my keys on that, in that area in the room. So I kept on going back and forth with this intuition. Just look down there. It's the only place you haven't looked, Hassan. You idiot. You're already late. Like might as well bow down and look, right? And go into prostration and look. Right? But then my mind was like, no, there's no way it's here. I've checked everywhere else. There's no possible way it's here. There's no way. Wallahi, whoever I'm talking to, there's no way it's down there. Right. So I was like, no, all right, fine. I'll do it. So I was having this weird psychotic conversation, with myself. And so then I bent down and I looked. And as soon as my mind was trying to say, see, it's not there, I heard and I felt it, something hit the ground. So I looked and it was my keys. That fell out of my pocket. That was right in me the whole time. My inner pocket when I was wearing a jacket. It was very cold. I forgot I put it here for some strange reason. And I spent all that time kind of looking around, right? And when that happened, I had this immediate insight that Allah wanted me to, he was teasing me, but to show me this. Actually, the answer is always inside you. But he wants us to prostrate. He wants us to humble ourselves. So that what is unveiled of what you're looking for. So, and it was a key, right, of all things, right? So it was a very special moment. I had a nice laugh with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it was very deeply humbling on that level, and also very, kind of revelatory. There's the insight, mashallah. But this is my point in sharing this, is that this is exactly what the path is. This is exactly what it is. Right? You will come to find why you do certain things or why they happen to you, right? And the unfolding will be a self-recognition that which you were seeking out there. I mean, because I bowed down with the belief that I accept I may find it there, but I didn't. I found it exactly where I was supposed to find it, but that was the means. It was the wasila for me finding it here. So Islam, Islamic practice, spirituality, the spiritual path is your wasila for finding what never left you to begin with. Only you left it in your awareness and your understanding. Right? Let me say one more line and I'll open it up. And no, that's fine, because this is the perfect point, as it's arising. Abu Yazid al-Bistami is very famed to have said that, that what we speak of can never be found by seeking it. What we speak of, even this realization, can never be found by seeking it. But then he says, but only seekers find it. SubhanAllah, what an amazing paradox, but it points to exactly this experience I had, right? It was only by bowing and looking in the most impossible place and verifying it wasn't there that I found it in here. It's an amazing, really, really amazing. Is an acceptance of the situation and a resorting to a higher power, right? And so I bent down for the sake of Allah, actually. It was not just because I was fighting myself. I was like, fine, I'll do this. And I was like, all right, perhaps there's some khair in this. And because obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed that insight or the thought in my heart. And I'm struggling against it because it's just not obvious at all. It's not there. And I proved it wasn't there. But for Allah, I did it. Right? and then it happened, and then the magic happened. So here, that that element of stopping, accepting, right? Stopping where you see the confrontation, right? Accepting the hesitation or the conflict or that wall that we're hitting, and then surrendering to the circumstances, right? Because the uncomfortability first wasn't her. Then she's helping others confront their uncomfortabilities, right? In that situation. So, but in internally where these two stories meet is this element of stopping and accepting and surrendering, and then the magic happens, whatever that is in terms of self-recognition, right. So that's a very profound story. So thank you very much for that. So let's see, I guess a final point where we've just hit like the hour mark, where we're an hour and 7 minutes. I wanted to keep this about an hour and 10 or an hour and 15 minutes, if possible. Is this second point about now, because I think we've hit this climax of contemplation, of reflection of what really Fana is and what you are actually in reality, and what the path is about in terms of the remembrance of God, and then awakening that remembrance of God, and the remembrance of presence, or the presence of remembrance in the heart, awakening it, abiding in it, to such an extent that then you realize that you never were what you thought you were, but you always were what you always have been and what you are, right? In the words of some of the Sufis, that what is annihilated is that which never was, and what subsists is that which always is and has been, right? This is what's happening, right? And so ultimately, at the heart of Fana and Baqa is a recognition, is an awareness of an ever abiding presence that now that was eclipsed somehow by something else, by a, you could say, an illusory or a relative identification with what we believe we were, but we realize we're not even that, right? Like, that's a huge wall to confront, right? But then we just simply accept and let it go, and the drop of the water returns to the ocean, realizing it's always been the ocean. The outer limitations of the form of the drop dissolve in the water of the ocean. And as Rumi so beautifully says, only for the ocean to come back out as the drop, right? That's baqa. That's a process. So if there was a first process of the spiritual path which leads to fana, you can say the whole process is the dissolving, the melting, the transcending of one level of self-knowledge or awareness to another, to another, to another, until there is complete dissolving into what we are and always have been. That's fana. But that's really only half the story, although it's taught as the end. It's really, at best, it's half of the story. But fortunate is the one who realizes that in this lifetime, in this life. It's only half the story. Now we must begin to come back out with this understanding, this new recognition, or a fresh recognition of what always has been. And we the work now, right? If the work of the path for the first half was refinement, purification, right, awakening, recognition, the work of the second half of the path of abidance is allowing this recognition, this realized understanding, to do the work, right? Because you no longer can do the work in the way you believed you were doing the work. It's very subtle also. Really understand this, right? Al-Hallaj is known to have said that when you realize fana fi tawheed, what happened to all your works? That's an amazing statement. Because his point is that when you realize your annihilation in the divine oneness, what happened to all the works that you did from the pivot of a center of believing that you were doing the work? If you weren't even real, then what was going on? You did a lot of work in the dream. You made a lot of accomplishments, but then you woke up and by analogy, you're waking out of bed. You're not doing anything, right? So what happened to all that work in the dream? That's another paradox, right? This is an amazing insight of al-Halaj, right? When it comes to Fana fi Tawheed, or just simply Fana, or realization of existential Tawheed, what happened to the you, the separate you, that was doing all that work to get here? How was that even happening if you weren't even real to begin with? It's a paradox. What the paradox is that if you hadn't done that work, which was necessary, although not sufficient for this recognition, because you don't exist in the way you believe you did. Right? It brought you to a place of stillness and openness, of acceptance and surrender, to actually take the dive, or just simply to return to what you've always been. And now, right? Now that work is realized that it was always Allah's work. Right? Now God's presence within wakes up to its own self in you. And now it begins to do the work. Allow it to do the work, because it was always doing it. When we were doing it, we were kind of hampering the work, honestly. Right? We got it, I lost it, did this, I think I've accomplished something. Okay, you reinforce very subtly a separative identity of spiritual accomplishment, what some call the spiritual ego. Right? In a very subtle way. I don't mean like a horrible spiritual ego who's abusing students. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about my sense of accomplishment on the path. I did a certain hours of like a spiritual retreat or a khalwa. I feel good about that. All right. Alhamdulillah, it's a blessing from God, as we remind ourselves. Right? But it gets to our head, right? Or I know that insight, I know this insight. It's to our head, right, as we call it. But the point is to be in the heart, right? To be the heart. So the second part of this, and I will just kind of leave it at this, is an unfolding, and it's more subtle work, because the work here is to continually aligning with what you've realized internally as your real self, and allowing this innermost secret of the sir to be embodied by itself, right? Learning the art of just moving out of the way and allowing the embodiment of the divine presence, right? Right. This is the part of the path I call the prophetic presence, practicing prophetic presence, in this way, that you allow the prophetic presence, which is the divine presence that one has realized, to align with your being, to relate with your life in the way that Allah would love you to, and beautifully. That can only be prophetic. It's not even yours, of who you believed that you were, and by simply allowing that to occur is what I call working with prophetic presence. If we could say here that the work with talking about the presences of the human presence is a work of refinement and purification, the work with the divine presence is to come to a place where we recognize that divine presence as our inmost self. And this process, all of this has led to Fana of what never was, of the separate self that was doing all this work and was refining, because we identified so much with the outer layerings of ourself and not the innermost layering or the innermost core, like the lub, as in the ulul albab, right? The Quran speaks of the people of the kernel. I like this translation by Dr. Chittick, because the usual is people of intellect, like that's a valid one. Right? Because intellect here means the center of your essence, your being, but it's confusing, right? The people of the kernel, you're coming back to the actual literal word, ulul albab, people, the kernels, like, the lub, the kernel of your being. That the person, the people, the kernel are the people, the kernels are those who have realized the kernel of their being and the essence of the kernel of their knowing and have embodied it. They possess it actually, and they live from it. Those are ulul albab. And they live beautifully, not because they live beautifully effortlessly, not because they're trying really hard. What they're trying hard to do is to get out of the way to allow the divine presence that has been awakened to simply embody itself in you and in your life and in all the roles of your life. That's the subtle work of Baqa. That's the second half of the path. We can make it the last third of the path. And the first two pertaining to Fana and the last to Baqa, right? Of the work of the human presence, the work of the divine presence, or the recognition or the discovery of the divine presence, and then the embodiment as the prophetic presence. This last part is Baqa, and it's what Tasawwuf speaks of when it speaks of the wilaya, that one is a wali of Allah, because they are they have an authoritatively embodied realization of God's presence as the center, as their real self, and they relate from there with everything by the authority of God, by God's will. That is wilaya. Right? There's a natural wilaya, and there's a more specific one in Islamic spirituality, one that follows the Muhammadan way. But there's a natural wilaya of attaining to fitra, and then just embodying that. Any human being can be sanctified like this. That's also what I would call sanctified presence or prophetic presence for an enlightened or an awakened being who simply kind of lives that from sincerity, from like the transparency of their realization between their inner and their outward. Right? But when it's done more prophetically, this is what we mean in Sufism by wilaya, by prophetic sanctity, by the authority of prophetic sanctity. This is really the real meaning of the word wilaya. As a final point, I've spoken of a few terms like the nafs, the aqal, like meaning the ego self, the intellect, the qalb, the heart, even the inmost, secret. In the Sufi path, the purpose is not just to awaken these things to simply awaken them. The purpose is that these are awakened and these are what they are. We're not trying to cultivate them. Right? We're trying to be with God and remember God and have a more permanent awareness of God, a presence with God. In that process, there will be shedding and there will be awakening of more subtle centers of our consciousness, of our being and knowing, that will, in all practicality, work with the other parts of yourself that have awakened or that need to be aligned, like your nafs and your aqal with the qalb, for example. So I'd like to make these ternaries, right? So if you've awakened your heart and it's more sustained, then your success at this point will be how naturally the nafs and the aqal align with the heart. But then when the sid is awakened, it's like you're still working with nafs always, but now it's the nafs and the heart and the intellect subsumed into the heart. You're still kind of working until there's full abidance and there's coming out. Now the sid itself is expressing itself through these centers, you could say, out into your outmost being. Once it affects authoritatively and establishes itself in your character, in your akhlaq, that is wilaya in the Sufi sense. That's what real sanctity is, right? So yes, that's a beautiful image. I really like that image, mashallah. So the image that that's Riyadh, that Brother Ryan, he gave what was the image of having a bucket of water. In terms of these three modes of spirituality that we were talking about here, these three presences and the parts of the path, to empty that water, because that's the water of Nafs in terms of consciousness, right? In the bucket. Then to place the bucket into the well and allow it to go down and receive the actual water in the depths of the earth, in the heart of one's being. And then to bring this out and to serve or to utilize it, right? These are really these like the human presence, because all the human presence is really about, or the work of it, of what I like to call the human presence, is about emptying, right? You really need to figure yourself out and then align yourself, right? In a kind of emptying of what you believed you were. In this process, then you will find what you actually are, that water deep in the depths of the earth. And then you will bring that out into and it will pour out and it will be used, right? In this context, there's a beautiful hadith that one who prays for 40 days, right? Or who does a retreat, like it's often interpreted as like one who to retreats for God's sake for 40 days, will have, the blessings of wisdom gush forth from their heart, right? And it really speaks to what you're saying, right? And what the Prophet ﷺ was implying there was a realization from the heart that is awakened by the retreat of 40 days that then manifests itself, embodies itself, expresses itself in one's life, right? That will be their state as a station, that they'll be able to do this, that what they have realized from their heart is what they can express in speech and most importantly in character, in akhlaq. So that's a very beautiful. I really do like that, and I like to use from the point of view of recognition. I often give the example of we believe that we are the particular. We're one among the many infinite particular rays of sunlight, right? And we're differentiated by the distance between one and the other. Some are more near each other, some are somewhere else. We're all distinct rays. We believe in that identity. That's what we are. That's our soul, right? Like that's what we are. That's what Khatija is. That's what Batul is. Like that's what Hasina is, right? Like that's what Riyadh is. That's what Hajjah is, right? So we're that individual, the unique light of ray, like in ray of light. But on the path, we traverse inwardly back to the source of that sunlight, of that ray of light, until we hit the sun itself, until we enter back into the sun. And there's a recognition by that ray of light that it has always been the sun. Now the sun can come out as itself, embodied as that ray. That is you. Right. So it's the same kind of, but from another angle, and it also fulfills the analogy of the drop of water going back into the ocean, and then the ocean coming back out as a drop. Right. But each one has a particular thing that it emphasizes. Right. So my analogy emphasizes continuity and that of a knowing identity, the continuity of the essence of identity, of the knowing subject. It mistook itself as only a ray amongst, kind of amidst other rays. But then it recognized that it's always been the sun. And not only was it the sun, it realized all of them were the sun. That is all one. But yet it still comes out as one particular ray, right? But also as the other rays, right? Like the analogy of Rumi, the dissolving of the drop of water emphasizes the Fana aspect, the dissolving of the distinction that we identified with, rather than its illusion, but the dissolving of its relative reality. Right? This is another perspective on the same reality. Right? And these are the varying emphases, also of the varying mystical traditions, some of which emphasize knowledge or knowing of the pure subject. For example, like the Vedanta. Right? And some that emphasize the dissolving of the separative subject, as does Sufism in Fana and Baqa. But even in Sufism, there's a recognition of knowing, right? But it may emphasize one over the other. And then this example of the water in the bucket is analogous. It emphasizes the spiritual work that's being done, right? Emptying the bucket. That's the action of the spiritual work of purification, of emptying. Now we're light enough to be sent, or now we're open enough, empty enough to be sent down to receive the real water. And so then the work is to go down, go within. You can only after emptying can you go within, right? Yeah.
Take certain experiences.
Yes.
Those are the
Mhm.
soil.
Yeah. Yes. 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 And it will lead to the same water accumulating if we don't do the work of purification. So this is the value and the purpose and the function of the traditional spiritualities that don't always start with your God or you're the self, right? Or you don't exist as a separate self. My experience of a separate self is pretty real to me, right? And I'm pretty bound by that. I'm conditioned by that, and so therefore that insight just totally missed me. It was not helpful, right? That this ends up happening, right? Because why? Because we haven't done the work. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, right? That the one who, like, he is successful, purifies themselves, right? The one who purifies themselves, right? Successful is the one who purifies himself. And there's other variations of that verse in other of the surahs, right? And so success is in this because God is starting you there, because that's where your recognition is as a nafs, right? And this needs to be purified, and by that is your success, right? There's other verses. Truth has come and falsehood has vanished, right? Verily, falsehood is always vanishing. Is just illusion. That's coming from the pivot of ma'rifah. That when you do that work and you're still and empty and transparent and open enough, you are now ready for the recognition of what you always were. Right? Truth has come, and falsehood has perished. Verily, falsehood is always vanishing, perishing. Right? This is fana, right? But the emphasis now is recognition, is knowledge, right? So there's a place for all of these paths as parts of your path. Um, one, you cannot have one without. So if you awaken to the knowledge, you have to integrate that knowledge into where you are, right? And more often than not, you will not be able to do so if you haven't done some work or sufficient work, kind of on the nafs. Um, uh, because on the one hand, there's the mirror. If we use the Islamic kind of metaphors and analogies of the heart, the polish of the heart, right? Of the Dhikrullah, as the Hadith says, right? Then the Sufis take this and speak of the mirror and polishing of the mirror of the heart, right? Because there is rust, the rust of forgetfulness, of heedlessness, of sin on it, right? As we polish that by the Dhikrullah, now finally the mirror is ready to reflect the light of God, right? Now in other words, now from the nafs that dominated the heart and sullied it and rusted it, and the conditionings of the world, now the nafs, or now the heart, rather the qalb is purified enough, polished enough that it can actually reflect the light of God as it is. But this qalb implies still existentially separation, distance from the source of the light as the light and the reflected light. It's now finally reflecting it as a heart. The final step, one could say, is to recognize that you're not even the mirror. That's also what you are. You're all these things, right? But you're not even the mirror. You're the light, right? That's the subtle pure identity of so going from even there where we're, because you're reflecting the light so much on the mirror that the mirror and the light become one, and then you realize that even the mirror, the surface of the mirror, the empty surface, thin surface that is a pure nothingness of the mirror, of the locus for the light, for the reflecting of the light that is the mirror. When you get to the heart of it, all it is light. There is no mirror, there's only light. Now the shift occurs. Existentially, I'm speaking of this realization, right? So there's more subtlety. And now that light can come out. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. If we even understand the first part as then Allah breaks it down, in this light verse of the mishkat and all of these kind of levels of interaction with the light. Right? But if we begin at the beginning, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. That means He is their essence, and by virtue of the light does everything exist and know itself. The knowing and the existing, or the knowing and the being, is a participation, a shared participation in the light of God. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. So ultimately, when we go back and extract to the pure substance, it's pure light. That's really what you are. Everything else is an accident, is the smoke on the fire. Coming back to what you said, right? So, this is why the wisdom of Sufism is that all of this as a framework is needed. If you have not done sufficient purifying, you will not sufficiently be established in the recognition of your real nature. And in order for this recognition of your real nature to really be embodied in your character, it won't happen. What will happen is that your nafs will come out again if you haven't done the work. So for both purification and embodiment, ideally a whole framework of tradition is needed. For us, Islam, the Islamic framework, that's a living, intact framework outwardly and inwardly, right? A protected framework by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because protection is needed in this. If you open yourself to the recognition that you're nothing other than God's presence, and you haven't done any work, or you have some preconditions or substantial tendencies or even mental illness, you will exacerbate those illnesses. In other words, you will exacerbate if you have not done the work to integrate in yourself. To some extent, I don't mean perfection. For the limit of what could be perfect can only happen by God, as He embodies His own presence in you, in a prophetic way. Right? Like that's all God's. You have to end, but for you to end, kind of all this comes in. But my point being that you could open yourself to even not only mental imbalances, but nefarious forces, right? Meaning the shaitan and these sort of things. And that's why a framework is needed for all of this work. This is the importance of it for everyone, right? So I wanted to say that. But what you could argue is independent of all of this is the recognition. One can have a stroke of insight, or an insight of this. One could be enlightened, whatever word you want to use, have like this mystical experience of pure oneness, that if you don't do the work, you cannot establish that experience in the center of your knowing and have it affect your character actually in a real, meaningful and abiding way. This is what Baqa is about. That's not possible without some work being done by you, right? So purification is necessary but not sufficient for realization. But for this realization to be embodied, what is necessary is all, kind of the whole framework. Usually, usually, of course, as the Bible says, the Spirit bloweth where it listeth, right? The divine mercy can do whatever, but as a general, in the most general sense. So Allahu Alam. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure if the Mubarakah sister Dua is still here. She had her hand raised, and then, as I'm sorry I made you raise it for so long that you put it down. So I see that you have put it down. If you'd like to say something, please feel free to open mic if you're still there. Can I speak of a friend who is a mirror for us? Yes. Part of the path is also, of course, I was speaking of a mirror in regards to your own inner mirror as the heart, right? But part of the path and the community is to befriend, others who are on the path and who have a similar intention, so that we become kind of supports for each other. This is where one can be a mirror, right? The famous hadith that, al-mu'minu yara'atan al-mu'min, or like the mu'min is the mirror to the believer, like the believer is a mirror to the other believer, right? This has been interpreted very subtly and very literally, that al-mu'min is God, actually. that God is the mirror of the Salik, who is the believer. So ultimately, that's the goal, that God is your mirror. This is from the Hadith. I mean, this is like, if you take the literal, that's one meaning. But it has the general meaning of that the believer is a mirror for the other believer. And so this is how a friend can be a mirror and a support, can help us. That if we look at the progression of the development of the human soul, right? Um, one has to be a sufficiently healthy and integrated soul to some extent. You're obviously not integrated. Everyone needs a path. We're not integrated, right? This is why we're seeking these things, right? I'm not saying being morally impeccable. Obviously, if that was the case, you wouldn't need a path, right? But um, once most human souls reach a maturity of ego, they may be open to or ready for a spiritual path to complete their trajectory of the human state in this realm, right? Now, in terms of a balance, so so my point there is that not everyone's meant for the path, right? And I don't mean to sound elitist, right? The Sometimes there are deficiencies in a particular soul that require other kind of methods and means, right? At the same time, one can be in a path and be working on these other aspects of themselves, right? They may have a deep spiritual side that has found their teacher or an opening to a framework, etc., and then they connect, they begin the practices, but now what's being unmasked is their shadow or things they've been working on that are just causing a lot of resistance. They need some help, and some need some help more than others. For others, it may even unmask like a mental illness. Right? This is not a deficiency on the teacher or on the framework or its lack of protection or whatever anyone wants to speculate on. It's just simply that's what the spiritual work does. For you to be fully integrated and annihilated, if I want to use like a majestic term in this sense, you have to God wants you to bring it all out. Right? Like I don't mean to stand on Mount Everest and scream at the top of your lungs and always every time you become angry, right? But you know what I mean, that in order for you to be integrated, God has to help your process. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to help that process to integrate the parts of you. A lot of that or some of that can be uncomfortable and even painful. Right? This is why you need a guide and friends and a community, right? There's certain things that Allah Ta'ala will choose when the right moment is for something to actually arise that now you need to work on, that as you'll see it as a pattern and it needs to be worked on because it is now stunting your spiritual growth, right? First it wasn't, but now it is, and now Allah wants you to work on it, most importantly now, rather than 5 years ago, even though it's still there, if you understand what I'm saying. In terms of finding a balance, now you're speaking of yourself or like in anyone. So I hope that part is clear, right? The We don't have to be perfect, kind of in our human presence and in the tazkiyah of the nafs. What Allah asks of us is the mujahada, element, to struggle with it, strive with it. Right? He doesn't ever say. Find out if I'd be interested if I'm wrong, which I don't think I am. But he doesn't ever say to perfect your nafs. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere. Right? There's Sufi texts that speak of like perfection, the path to perfection. Like, so what does that mean? Does that really mean? No, it means that like the path of the absence of your imperfection that is your existence. Right? From a metaphysical standpoint, that's what the path of perfection is. The point is that you can never be perfect, but to work on yourself and to continue to is all that Allah asks. Those who struggle for our sake, not those who perfect themselves for our sake. So the verse in Ankabut says this: those who struggle in our cause, we shall guide them to our paths. So the mujahada of the nafs is what's necessary, not overcoming it entirely. That's up to God. The results are up to Allah. So this is a very important point. Just by that, something else awakens in you. Because for you to struggle with yourself, something has to be aware of that. And then at some point that begins to awaken in you and you become more interested in that. That's the transcendence part of that work. You may still have a problem, but now you've awakened to a more kind of subtle and kind of deeper mode of consciousness in you that then can help you do the work, right? It doesn't even matter anymore, I shouldn't say it that loud, but to perfect that problem because something's awakened in you, as long as it's kind of sufficiently integrated and you're able to kind of work with it. I mean, especially if it's a vice. If obviously a vice is going to be a hindrance, it's going to continue being a hindrance kind of in your life. You have to continually to work on it. But the point is not again to perfect a vice, like to fully eliminate it. That's up to Allah. It's for you to see it and to struggle with it in faith that Allah will take care of it and you because you tried in God's name. Right. I just want to emphasize that first because there's a kind of assumptions in one's perfection, right? And when one speaks of kind of breaking the self, sometimes in spirituality, it's not that. It's actually kind of breaking open the self so that you see what's beyond it. That's really what's happening in spirituality. And then at some point that which is beyond it will integrate it back, right? This is one of the meanings of Imam Abul Hasan al-Shadili when he says that the end of their path is our beginning, which means awakening and realization is the beginning of our path, which is the apparent end of others. And then he says, and the beginning of their path is our end. This is even more, elliptical. What this really means is that embodying this realization into our nafs and our character, working with our nafs, is what we do at the end. Although, of course, you're supposed to do that at the beginning as you're awakening to the path. Now, I'm sorry for that tangent, but I thought that would be important just in terms of context that it's one has to be to some degree a healthy soul to be able to withstand the burden and the pressures of spiritual practice, right? Just kind of like an athlete has to become fit enough to do exercises or to play a sport. So not everyone can be a particular athlete in a particular sport or something. Um, um, the way to know in yourself when you're overdoing it is just the internal resistance, the kind, right? Like we're going to resist like, oh, I don't want to do this. Like that's like nafs, like that's a regular nafs, right? But the long-standing effect of burnout, like kind of for example, I'm speaking to everybody, but you know who I'm speaking to. The because it's a general thing. When you see a pattern of burnout, right, you're doing something wrong. Just be aware of this. That when you burn out, right, you've worked spiritually for too long, or for too much, or too hard, or too intensely in the wrong place. Right. This is so the burnout is actually a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, kind of showing you kind of are doing that wrong. It's a good intention, but you're supposed to be working in some other way. Now that effort's supposed to be a bit more subtle. There's some other angle of this. It's not just about the activities of the practice, but maybe it's about the attitudes that should have been awakened or should be awakened. I need to focus on that a little bit more, or something else, like I'm not reading enough or reflecting enough on spiritual values and truths and the teachings of Islam, for example, whatever. I need to refine my intelligence rather than just work on the will. Right? It's not going to get you, everywhere, right? And likewise, my attitude. If I cultivate our attitude, if it's not embodied by the will, it will not be. It will not be stable. Like that. Like the our attitude won't take root. Right? If the will is not brought in, and also the why of it, like why are we grateful? Because it feels good, okay? But is there something more, right? The source of gratitude, where it comes from, what it tells me about what I am, the expansion of my heart, why being grateful connects me to what I actually am, right? Do you see the why there, right? Like in terms of identity, right? Rather than it makes me feel good, or rather than it will increase me in provision. Your goal is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. kind of on the spiritual path, your goal is not to better yourself. Very important. Innama amalu bin niyat. Right? Your goal is not to better yourself. That's impossible, actually. Without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is impossible. You'll have temporary modes of success, of bettering a quality or one aspect of your personality or character, right? Or working on a vice, right? You know, as a personal example, I'm not going to give you the example, but there was a vice I've had that for a whole year I did not even think about. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, from my angle, that's a miracle. That's really a miracle, right? You know, istiqama is the karama, right? But then the thoughts came back and the feelings came back as certain life circumstances begin changing, right? So I thought that, well, what, you know, like, you know, what happened here? Is this a failure? No, no. The constant under all of that was the remembrance of Allah. This is a very important point. It was not, you know, Allah may use the vice as an excuse to get you to remember Him and to be with Him, actually. He may use a problem, and He will, to get you to remember Him and just be consistent in this. Let that be your measuring rod. And I don't even mean how much you're doing the invocation, you know, how long are your awrad, or how many hours are you sitting in the long wird, or all the wird that you've accumulated from your sheikhs. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about how much do you think and feel Allah. That's what I'm talking about, right? So if we do all these things and we feel burnout, and then we stop them, like meaning the invocations and the awrads, there's a fundamental problem in how we were relating with the work at that point. Because at the beginning, it may have been important because you needed to engage at the will, but at some point, we lost track of the actual, or lost sight of the actual goal, which is simply a remembrance of God as a state of being, a state as a mode of feeling, as a you know, kind of as a fixed thought, kind of inner being, kind of inner soul. That's the purpose of the dhikrullah. So that you become dhikrullah in this way, so that you think God, you think about God, you feel God's awareness. You are happy with God even when you're really hurting. That's the purpose. So if we burn out and we stop those things and then we see we're going through a tumultuous thing, it's a great opportunity, still from Allah, to actually take a step back and look in your muhasaba, just observe what you were doing, how you were doing it, especially how you were doing it. And then that'll lead you to why you were doing it. Right? So, you know, almost in that ordering, which will be helpful. So both, you know, excess and a deficiency will lead to the same place. A lack of integration, no, I'm not even talking about personal integration. A lack of integration in a more permanent presence with the remembrance of God. Right? That's the goal. That's the intention. How present am I with God? Am I present with Him when I'm angry? Am I present with Him when I'm happy? How present am I with Him in hardship? How present am I with Him in ease? How present am I with Him in the struggle? Right? Fana and Baqa is the whole path. So we stayed within the realm of the topic, right? That if the first half of the path is Fana, the second half is, you know, Baqa, right? And in the Fana is purification, all these things until you dissolve, or until you realize your nothingness, until you have the recognition that what you were was an illusion, and what is always is, and now requires itself to be embodied in your character, in your thinking, in your feeling, in your being, in your interacting. But without your effort, but simply from the unfolding of what is now, right? Like that is Baqa. So we'll end with that, inshallah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. العصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. لا إله
illallah, la ilaha 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 illallah.